Start the recording and we'll get rolling here.
All right, recording started. Go ahead.
Okay, well, hello everyone. Happy Friday the 13th in this ever lucky year of 2020. I'm Mike Barnett. I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third session in our inaugural QUASI seminar series. These seminars are designed as debates on important topics related to social innovation. Our aim isn't to convince you that a certain perspective or answer is correct. We're not here to crown winners in these debates or even to take polls about it, but as tempting as that can be to try and figure out who the winner is. Instead, we want to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying these topics. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, and teachers of the material underlying these debates, we know all too well that too much of the literature focuses on uninteresting questions that only rehash and rename established ideas. It's our sincere hope that by pointing out what is known on all sides of the debate in very pointed and direct ways that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, does corporate social and environmental responsibility create value for consumers? Answering in the affirmative is Leviathan's hammer, Caroline Flammer. Answering in the negative is fellow member of the NYU Stern diaspora and fellow co-author of Kings, Mike Lenox. Arguing that it depends and bringing the ooh la la from La La Land, it's Magali Delmas. And finally, moderating this mayhem is the scourge of university administrators far and wide and a man of no fixed address. I give you Timothy Michael Patrick Devinney. All right, so each in turn will argue their position. As they do so, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. When we get to Timothy, he'll synthesize and extend the arguments as well as offer his own perspective. The open discussion will occur after all four of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that will remain thereafter. So let's get the party started. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much. You should give us basically a minute to just laugh about your jokes before we have to start speaking.
It's usually not funny, so it's not necessary.
So first of all, thank you so much, Mike, for organizing this phenomenal seminar series and for inviting me to this fantastic panel. It's going to be very hard to, be the opponent of Mike Lenox. All right, so the question of today is, does corporate social and environmental responsibility create value for customers? Now, before I answer this question, let me just take a step back and look at the broader business environment. Okay, so just to say the obvious, and just in case you have not realized it yet, we are in the midst of multiple crises, multiple system crises, global pandemic, social injustice, climate crisis, you name it. Now, a first immediate reaction of many folks is, well, it's the government's responsibility to tackle this crisis and to fix them. But let's open our eyes, look outside what's going on in the world. It's unfortunately the case that in many, many countries, there's a lack of government leadership for different reasons. Maybe unwillingness to address this crisis, maybe they are unable or just simply incapable. Okay, but in short, there's often a lack of public governance. In my view, one of the critical issues is that there's, for example, in many countries around the world, there's a lack of mandatory disclosure requirements for non-financial information. So just to give you an example, in the US, the SEC recommends that companies disclose such information, but it does not mandate it nor provide any guidance in how to disclose ESG issues. So ESG standing for environmental, social, and governance issues. Of course, the SEC does require companies to disclose financial material information. That means information that is material to the company's operations within 1 year. But this, of course, begs the question of, well, what ESG issues are really financial material within 1 year? So in absence of public governance, what is the result? The result is that many companies often fail to disclose relevant non-financial information. They may engage in greenwashing and other irresponsible practices. Now, those companies that do disclose ESG information, they may disclose it in non-standardized ways. Okay, this leads to messy data that we have to, all of us have to deal with that. And the difficulty for us, as well as perhaps more importantly for customers, financial analysts, and other market players to assess the true ESG performance of companies. I would like to mention that private organizations such as Ceres and SASB, they have made major progress in providing guidance to companies as well as fostering the standardization of ESG disclosure. All right, so with this in mind, let me rephrase your question, Mike, and ask, in absence of public governance, does companies' social environmental responsible practice create value for customers? And I will tackle this question in two ways. First, I will talk about the actual CSR performance of companies, and then talk about greenwashing practices. Do they create value to customers? Well, the short answer to this question seems to be yes, they can. And specifically, when we look at, for example, the business to consumer sector, so where the end consumer is the customer of the company, we know from existing literature that considering the interests and needs of consumers and others can foster innovation, enhance customer satisfaction, and increase consumer demand. Now, given that end consumers typically need to work in order to earn the money that they can eventually spend on products and services provided by companies, end consumers are also employees, okay? So existing literature also suggests that providing better work conditions, benefits, and meaningful work, surprise, surprise, does enhance employees' engagement, their experimentation, and innovative productivity. It also fosters the retention of talented employees and mitigate adverse behavior at the workplace and knowledge leakage. Okay, so overall, there can be positive value to the end consumer. The second type of customer is the government. So here we are looking at the business to government sector, and the existing research suggests that companies' CSR track record, so a track record in responsible practices, can signal trustworthiness to the customer, in this case the government, and hereby help mitigate transaction costs. So again, there's value to the customer. Now, what is the challenge? Well, the challenge is, as I pointed out before, many of these social environment practices are very difficult to observe for customers, especially in absence of a mandatory disclosure requirement. Okay, so as a result, companies may exploit this information asymmetry and engage in greenwashing and other irresponsible practices. And perhaps one reflection of this is the recent statement of the Business Roundtable, where we know that was a lot of smoke, a lot of talking, but not so much of walking. There are two potential remedies to mitigate greenwashing concerns. One is the role of certification. So for example, in one of my recent studies, I looked at the green bond market, and I find that certification really plays a critical role for companies to signal to investors and others that they're serious about engaging in more sustainable practices moving forward. And then, of course, there's industry self-regulation. Given that we have two mics and two experts on this panel that have done extensive research in this area, I'm not going to delve deeper into this, but these are potential remedies of avoiding greenwashing. All right. So last but not least, let me discuss the revised research questions that Mike asked us to pose. So what else can be done to foster responsible practices and increase customer value? Well, first, Mike did ask us to do so, say what do we recommend to stop doing, and then highlight what avenues would we suggest of pursuing. So I hope I'm not offending anyone on this conference call. If I do, apologize. I do, with a Swiss smile. But I would recommend that we stop asking the question whether CSR pays off, and to stop framing our studies around the Friedman versus Freeman debate. In my view, this is an old debate, so to speak, from the pre-COVID times, okay, really old. It's a false dichotomy. And quite frankly, I don't think it's a very fruitful debate. It does not really help us tackle some of the grand societal challenges that we are facing and help fix the crisis that we are exposed to. Okay. Instead, I would encourage us to ask a different set of questions. For example, how can we stimulate innovation and the development of products and services that address the needs of the poor and underserved customers? And how can we foster a more system level thinking and more responsible practice, not just of the companies, but also the customers? And here I'm thinking about, for example, minimizing food waste, promoting healthier lives, etc. And then I mentioned the lack of public governance, the lack of government leadership. Potentially fruitful avenue is also to think about how can organizations effectively engage in not just CSR, but also corporate political actions to provide value to the customer and help address grand societal challenges. And last but not least, we know these grand societal challenges are very complex and it's impossible for one single company to address them all. So potentially fruitful avenue is also how can organizations form effective partnerships to make progress in achieving the UN SDGs. And I stop here, as I'm not much of a talker. I try to walk more than talk.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Caroline. That is well within the time frame, and I think we'll just keep moving so that we can save the time for combined discussion at the end. And so we will now move on to Mike Lenox.
All right. Well, thank you all for having me today. Thank you, Mike and Rutgers, for hosting this. I think this is a wonderful idea during the COVID crisis here. I'm very excited to be with Caroline and Magali and Tim, people I've known for years and who I respect greatly here. I'm going to take a tack with my arguments here that is kind of a classic debate tactic, which is rather than debate on the merits, the empirical work that Caroline has done a wonderful job both contributing to and summarizing there, I'm going to raise the question that actually you raised right at the end there, Caroline, that I actually think it's a folly to ask the question in the first place. So let me kind of walk through why I feel that way. So the basic thesis that we have today is social responsibility, environmental responsibility has a positive relationship with customer value. And so what I'm going to endeavor to show you in the next 15 minutes is on all dimensions, this is a flawed question. The independent variable is flawed, the dependent variable is flawed, and the relationship hypothesized between them is flawed. So let me begin with some observations. So observation one, social responsibility, the construct, is ultimately in the eye of the beholder. So I have here a picture of Walmart, and in particular, this is the gun section of Walmart. And so people, especially in the States, probably remember just a couple of years ago in the wake of a number of our unfortunate instances of gun deaths in the United States, there have been calls for Walmart to stop selling guns. Now, personally, I subscribe to that. I would love to see Walmart stop doing that. But here in the United States, there's a good number of people in the population who disagree with that and would argue it would be socially irresponsible for Walmart to stop selling guns because of our Second Amendment rights and the like. And I share this story just to highlight again that social responsibility is ultimately a social construct and that we can have differences across people in the population of what is and what is not socially responsible. I think at the end of the day, when we talk about social responsibility, we're typically talking about progressive left values, if we call it to what it is. Again, to be clear, I subscribe to most of these values myself, but to be clear, not everybody does. And there again are disagreements on what is and it is not socially responsible. Complicating matters further is to recognize that what is deemed socially responsible, even by those on the progressive left, is constantly changing. Just 8 years ago, President Barack Obama was still not on board with same-sex marriage in the United States. Imagine now a company who was not supportive of same-sex marriage, we would say they're not socially responsible. Yet again, 8 years ago, we had a different perspective. So social responsibility is a social construct. There's differences in opinion, and it is constantly evolving. So again, typically when we evoke this notion of social responsibility, what we're really saying is today's progressive liberal values, and that's a problematic construct, as I've just tried to argue. Okay, second observation, this is on the dependent variable. Customer value creation is a firm strategic choice, and this is very, very important to recognize. This is something that I think is problematic in the strategy literature writ large, that we forget that who your customers are is not some abstract exogenous variable here, but it is in fact a strategic choice. So here we have three companies that I think historically people would say these are socially responsible firms: Ben & Jerry's, Whole Foods, Patagonia. All three of them target a consumer market that is actually very limited. They charge high price premiums for those who value the values that Ben and Jerry share, and Whole Foods and Patagonia. Here are three more companies, Dairy Queen, Food Lion, and Altered State. Dairy Queen and Food Lion actually have historic conservative roots to them. They cater to a very different market. Both of them tend to have lower prices. They go to a more mass market here. Altered State is an interesting one in that they are a kind of a high-end differentiated player going for consumers willing to pay a price premium. But as the Alter and Altered State may suggest to you, this is actually an evangelical Christian religious organization that is selling goods and services, as they say, for the glory of Christ. Now, again, whether you deem that as socially responsible or not, that is in the eye of the beholder. But what is very clear in all of these cases is that firms have made strategic choices about who their customers are and the value they're trying to create for them. So when it comes to customer value, I think we need to be very specific here in the kind of traditional economic strategy way. What we're really talking about is the spread between the willingness to pay and the price paid for a targeted set of consumers here. One of the things we sometimes fail to think about as we talk about customer value is if I create value for you and your willingness to pay because you value some set of, let's say, progressive liberal values again, but then I charge you a very high price, I might not actually be creating that much value for you at the end of the day. And again, this is all endogenous because as a business, I get to choose which customers I target and how I'm trying to create value for them. Perhaps Food Lion is the most socially responsible company on my previous list because they charge low prices, right? And that might create more value for customers at the end of the day. All right, continuing. Observation 3 here. I would assert that there has to be decreasing returns to social responsibility. It would be highly unlikely to see the following idealized relationship here, a linear relationship between social responsibility and customer value. And so much of our empirical work at the end of the day is assuming a linear relationship between the two of these. At the very least, one would expect the following, that as you increase social responsibility, the marginal contribution to customer value, however you define it, is going to be decreasing here. And I think there's a lot of empirical evidence out of marketing and otherwise that suggests when it really comes down to like willing to pay a price premium for something socially responsible, there's only so much more you're willing to pay. You know, think about some of our efforts at Darden here to decrease our waste. You know, the effort to go from 90% recycling to 95% recycling, you know, how much value does that actually create for our students at the end of the day? What I do know is that we typically see exponentially increasing costs as we try to increase our social responsibility. So that last little bit of recycling is really hard to achieve and very expensive to do so. And I think that's true over any number of different kind of social responsibility dimensions or environmental responsibility dimensions. That's important because if we look at the difference between the value creation and the firm cost, what we are going to likely get is a concave relationship. This is an argument that Andy King and I made 20 years ago in our original management science paper here, is that one would expect that there is a point at which increased social responsibility will decrease firm profits and likely, again, not marginally increase customer value. And so that's really important because, again, I'm arguing not that this relationship is actually kind of fundamental to how we should think about this, that there should be some concave relationship here. So again, in terms of this thesis of a positive linear relationship, or even if I'm allowing for some decreasing relationship, it's most likely to be a concave relationship. But it's even more complicated than that, because I would argue at the end of the day, managers have discretion in whether to invest in CSR. I long tell my students that I think the worst thing we have pervaded in business school is the notion that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholders' return. That is false, I would argue, on a moral standing, but also false from a legal standing as well. At the end of the day, managers have quite a bit of discretion on how they will invest. This is why corporate philanthropy exists, why there are some firms who position themselves as more responsible than others potentially. I put some in there because yes, there are disciplinary mechanisms in terms of corporate governance, in terms of publicly traded companies that might limit the degree to which you do this. But again, there's some discretion. So if we go back to this idea that there's a concave relationship. If you believe a linear relationship, then in essence, you have to believe that firms are fundamentally underinvesting in CSR by their own narrow self-interest here. And there's a lot of behavioral arguments for why that might be. And I actually believe there are probably many firms who are underinvesting in CSR. But let's be clear, that's the argument that you're making. There's also the likelihood, though, of what we might call overinvestment in CSR, or social responsibility. And I put here, to be provocative, Milton Friedman's CSR. So let's be very clear. Milton Friedman says, if you can get paid to do CSR, it is not CSR by his definition. That's just good business. By his definition, CSR is only those things to the right of my blue line here. It is only when, in essence, you have the Pareto optimal frontier between social responsibility and payoffs here. Now, he makes a moral argument that the correct position on this Pareto optimal frontier is where the blue line is, at the very top of the arc there. That's a moral argument that I have a lot of problems with, and I think there's many compelling arguments for why a firm and organization might pursue somewhere else on that Pareto optimal frontier. But again, that's more of a moral argument than an empirical argument here at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, we have a very problematic independent variable that is constantly changing and represents a certain set of values that aren't necessarily embraced by everyone. We've got a dependent variable that is an endogenous choice of the firm. And as a result, we have, in essence, an endogenous concave relationship. And it reminds me, if people remember kind of Miles Shaver's seminal piece about foreign market entry and how if you don't address this econometrically, you're likely to get spurious results here. And that probably explains a lot of why we have such kind of back and forth on whether it pays to be green or pays to do CSR, is because, again, we're not thinking through this endogenous nature of the decision question that we have. So I come to the same conclusion Caroline is, which I was hoping that we stop doing these studies, right? We stop writing these papers because, again, I think they're fundamentally flawed. I'm aghast that the finance folks are now suddenly discovered this whole thing and they're looking at whether ESG pays because they're falling into these same exact traps. So I like this, question, and this is definitely self-promotion here, but how do we design systems to drive firm innovation to create positive public externalities? This is in essence the book that Ronnie Chatterjee and I put out last year is about. Despite the title, Can Business Save the Earth, which is clearly, that was just meant to be provocative. If we had the title that I wanted, this question I have above, we would never sell any books because that's just way too long and complicated there. But in essence, what we're arguing in the book is that we need to look at the broader institutional envelope in which business operates and markets function. That includes government regulation, it includes government intervention, but it also includes non-state actors, maybe activist groups, it might include universities, it includes private intermediaries, financiers, trade associations and the like. All of them have an influence on the degree to which firms innovate. And the question, of course, for us who are interested in these questions is how do we drive innovation towards these either sustainable outcomes or these what we might deem as socially responsible outcomes. And I want to be very clear here when I talk about positive public externalities. I think one of the misframings we've had in a lot of our discussions around these issues is taking the classic negative externality framing, which assumes that the entity itself is creating a negative externality, and it's how do we incentivize them, or when do incentives exist to internalize that negative externality. But that's not necessarily how the world's working. So I'll just leave you, So really what we're talking about here is, in essence, how do we shift out that innovation curve, right? How do we shift it out? That to me is the interesting question. And how do we create the incentives and the market opportunities to do so? So this last point, I just wanted to raise Tesla as an interesting example. At the end of the day, Tesla is not solving a negative externality that they created, right? The negative externality is being created by General Motors and the history of those who've made internal combustion engines. Tesla, though, is solving a public externality, which is climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, through the innovation of a new product or service to disrupt an industry, right? And so again, my perspective of the last decade or so has really been this one towards systemic innovation. How do we design the system to get the outcomes we want to? I think those of us in kind of the strategy fields and related fields have a lot to say about this. And I wish we would let's move on from does it pay to be green or does it pay to do CSR? So with that, I'll leave you with the QED here and turn it over to Magali.
That is awesome. I love the idea of tackling the question itself, questioning the question, and then going with curvilinear relationships. One other quick thing I want to point out is my whole life has been a lie. I always thought that Timothy Devinney was Tim Devinney, and now Magali, are you Magali or Maggie, or do you care? Or
I am, whoever you want me to be. Maggie is just simpler, so that's why I choose it. Can you see my screen here?
Absolutely.
Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough act to follow. Mike and Caroline, I really agree with both of you. I love your work, and so I'm glad actually, Mike, that you decided to put me on this. Agreeing with everyone and saying it depends. So does corporate social and environmental responsibility create value for consumers? So it depends on the green bundle, and I'm going to do a little bit of self-promotion following Mike's example in terms of the recent book that we published on this subject. I feel like we need to take more of a consumer perspective. Here we're talking, like from a strategy perspective, but we need to kind of think about, who the consumers are and what they really kind of want to purchase. If we want to use the market as a tool to promote corporate social responsibility, we need to think about the market. The markets are consumer, they're people like you and I. So, when you ask people about, kind of whether they care about the environment, and all the surveys kind of come to the same thing. And this is one survey we conducted. When you ask people, how much they care about the environment, and this question is like, if things continue on their present course, we will soon experience a major catastrophe. 73% say, yes, I do care about, about the environment. So the question is, though, then when you get this kind of overwhelming kind of agreement, and we've seen that with more and more activism towards climate change, then when you look at the actual market share, it's very, very small. We still have very, very few green or sustainable products. So what's going on there? And I know Tim has worked a lot on that too. It's just there's kind of this real gap. What are we missing in the, what is the marketplace missing? How do we get from this 73% to this, 10%, sorry, to this 73%? What's going on there? And so I think that, we can't rely on the dark green consumers. And maybe we've been thinking that if you care about the environment, you're going to buy green products and that's going to solve the problem. But I think a lot of us are here in the middle, convenient environmentalists. And we are convenient environmentalists because we have all these excuses. We say the products are too expensive or lower quality. I don't know, I don't understand. And Caroline was talking about greenwashing, and I don't trust this thing. So in fact, very few people say, I don't care about the environment. So kind of how do we remove these excuses? How do we get consumers to actually, get to the next steps? And I agree with Mike, innovation is one of the solutions in terms of, finding products that have some characteristics that people actually are willing to pay. So what is going to overcome this gap? Research tells that consumers buy green products when they benefit not just the environment, the public good, but themselves. So they provide some co-benefits, some private benefits to them. So here I'm going to describe 5 of these co-benefits: quality, status, health, money, and emotion. So these, I'm going to argue that products that actually display these benefits are more likely to reach the consumers. And that's an important part of the equation. We need to think about, kind of human behavior and, use behavioral science more. So quality, so actually Mike mentioned, Tesla. Most people buy Tesla not because it's green, but because it's a great car, because of the quality. We've done some research on wine. You find out that when you actually have sustainable practices, you can reach a better quality wine. So then you bundled quality here with, sustainability. So there's a relationship. We've seen it with, also organic products more generally. Here we have certified wines which increase their, kind of their ratings with, organic certification. If I think about status, we did conduct some research. Status is another benefit. And this research is where we provided information in real time to students at UCLA about their electricity usage, about, you know, kind of how much they consume by source. And the idea was that when providing this information, people will act. What happened with this? Nothing, okay? The students didn't change their behavior. Why? Well, they thought it was kind of a nice website and so on, but they just didn't change their behavior. So what we did is we made the information public. We published every week, kind of with green dots, you're, you know, better than the average user, you're consuming more, I mean, less energy, and then red if you consume more energy. This worked like a charm. This was exposed in, you know, public places. Students reduced their electricity usage by 20%. When we made the information public, it worked. That was kind of status at work. The students didn't want to be perceived as high users. Next in the green bundle, health. Health is powerful. I think that when you even put it against money, it wins. And we've seen that recently. Health trumps almost everything else. So here we did another experiment, another field experiment. We provided real-time information to 120 homes about the electricity usage at the appliance level. They received information about their lights, their fridge, their microwave, dishwasher, and so on. In addition, in this experiment, one group received information about money, how much money they could save, and the other group received information about you know, kind of impact of electricity usage on health, childhood asthma and cancer. And there was a control group that did not receive information, but we observed them. What happened with this? You know, the group that did receive the message about money did not save any electricity. They just couldn't care. The second group did save electricity, 8%. So that research that we published with Omar Sancio showed that money was not actually at that point very, very motivating, maybe because money was not as high enough, but health was a very important driver here. People discovered that their electricity had an impact on, their electricity usage had an impact on health, and they cared. Money, so I just told you that money didn't work in that experiment, and maybe it was because it was not enough. And that's complicated. As you know, money is the fourth, you know, element of the green bundle. Savings can motivate people, and that's what people tell us. I want to save energy because I want to save money. But as you know, we're discounting the future. It has been really hard to motivate people to kind of, you know, install energy efficient appliances, to buy solar panels. So that's why we need to kind of be also framing this information in a way that people see kind of how much they're saving immediately. And that's an example of, you know, of an ad that does that. One, you know, way around is to make the savings bigger. Last element of the bundle, emotion. Empathy is when we are moved by others, by other people's situation, and we want to help them. And when green purchase or social purchase helps us connect with others, and this is the example of Tom's shoes. I buy a pair of shoes, then, you know, Tom's gives a pair of shoes to a child in need. That kind of that connection is really, you know, important. Can be this model one-for-one has been pretty successful. So that's kind of the last one. So what I'm arguing is, I think if we want to drive sustainable behaviors through the marketplace, we need to get realistic of what drives human behavior. And some of our research in strategy has in some ways a little ignored, you know, the consumer as you know, kind of it functions. And, you know, it's kind of, we have the black box of the organization sometimes, but we also have a little bit of a black box of the, you know, the marketplace, the consumer side. So I think we can't expect consumers to be virtuous on their own. We all want to do the right thing, but, you know, we have, you know, kind of a bunch of other considerations to take into account. So I would say, if you to rephrase a little bit, the question is, you know, we need to have more of a behavioral approach of what drives human behavior. And you know, the question is how to promote conservation behavior. So I will leave you with this, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you very much. So this is great. Everybody's coming at this from different angles, which is exactly what this is supposed to do. And now the minor job of putting it all together and trying to bring some coherence to this. All's to Timothy. On to you.
Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks Michael and his team for pulling all this together, and also Mike Lennox, Carolyn, and Maggie. What I'm going to try to do is to pull this in, but I've actually obviously had to create a set of slides, which I changed in real time as people talked a little bit. But I've titled this "The Complexity of Consumer Value Confusion." And I'm going to come to a conclusion in the end, I think, which will merge a few of the ideas, but also potentially toss out a few provocative things I think that people should think about. What I want to start is I'm going to start with some definitions or some ideas. First is this idea of what does a consumer mean, and what does it mean to consume? And if you look at the history of this, and you look at the origin of the word consumer, it comes from consumere, which means to use up. And as you go to Adam Smith made the whole argument that is the basis of most economic models, which is the point of production is consumption. And it was a little bit about what Mike was talking about. In other words, you don't produce to produce. You don't produce simply to make employees happy. You produce so that consumers can consume. The second point of this is related to heterogeneity and what people do. And for this, I kind of call to the great philosopher Elizabeth Taylor. And that is, the problem with people who have no vices is generally that you can be pretty sure that they're going to have some pretty annoying virtues. And the point here is I think we at times in a lot of the work, there is this amorphous view of consumers as being either good or bad, as having a perspective that can be aligned as ethical, or the alternative, which people tend to not talk about, which is the unethical consumer. And the reality is that people are amazingly complicated, and to stylize them in segments, or to stylize them as ethical or non-ethical, or green or not green, I think belies the real value that consumers bring in terms of what they do. And the final comment I want to kind of focus on here is something which was in the Financial Times today, and that is about sustainable fashion. There's no such thing. In spite of all the discussions on sustainable fashion, the amount of clothing purchased is increased, and the use of that the clothing in terms of the nature of the number of times it is worn before it's tossed away has decreased. So in spite of all the rhetoric, the reality is nowhere near anything like this, even though this has become a big industry. And it's not only people like me saying this, it's people like Stella McCarthy. And that is, I barely even know what the word sustainable is anymore. The majority of people say they want to do a sustainable thing if you ask one question, and that'll fall by the wayside. Okay, it's a bit tiring seeing people overuse these terms and not really have any substance to back it up. And in the book, The Myth of the Ethical Consumer, at the end, one of the things that we talk about is we talk about this notion of individual social responsibility. And that is that rather than thinking about things like CSR, think about all the components: consumer social responsibility, employee social responsibility, managerial social responsibility. And these things have to kind of line up. You can't argue that one should exist and the others simply can kind of get free rides on the good things that we're expecting corporations to do. The other aspect of this is that consumers are different. In other words, if we look at the way in which we've studied firms or employees or investors, they exist within constrained environments. Firms and managers report to boards. They have a level of transparency. They have a level of KPIs. Employees have work contracts. They're measured on their individual performance. Investors are measured on what returns they generate for the pension funds. Yes, other things come in, but there are mixes that constrain these behaviors, which means that the heterogeneity that might otherwise exist, in other words, the managers do not have free rein over the decisions that they make. They report to boards of directors. And as someone who sits on several boards of directors, I can tell you immediately that managers don't have a choice in terms of the nature of investing in A versus B, or philanthropy versus non-philanthropy. These have to be approved approved within governance rules. Employees don't have free reign. Investors don't have free reign. But if we look at consumers, consumers are really difficult because each individual consumer can define for themselves what value is. And under those sets of circumstances, heterogeneity reigns. And singular models don't necessarily work, which is why marketers in the past talked about the notion of consumer segments of one. The ability to engage in mass customization implies that what you do is you identify the value being generated for a single consumer and you create products for that single consumer. And therefore, as Mike pointed out, this idea that you can think that there's potentially kind of a model that says, well, here's what the return is to consumers. Okay, I would agree with Maggie by saying there's too much heterogeneity here. What consumers are you talking about? What of the 7 billion people on the planet are you really discussing when you're talking about value to consumers? And also, and this is going to reinforce a bit of what Maggie says, is there are different models and different ways in which consumers make decisions. And I just highlight a few of them here. In other words, they can make rational decisions or they can make impulsive decisions. The rational decisions are driven more by intent, and a lot of the literature talks about the theory of reasoned action. But as most people would argue, consumers don't engage in the theory of reasoned action. They don't necessarily engage in all the balanced trade-offs. Impulsive behavior may actually be driven entirely by the context. I may not want to drink a Coca-Cola because I prefer Pepsi, but if I actually walk into a store and it's a Coke store and there's nothing but Coke, I will drink a Coke. Okay, so in some sense, there's a dimension which is related to the nature of, well, can I go through a rational decision process, or am I simply going to make an impulsive decision, which might be habitual or might be driven by the set of circumstances in which I find myself? Is the decision going to be habitual or calculative? If it's calculative, it has a very high cognitive load. I am not going to spend an enormous amount of time engaging in trade-offs when I don't have the time or the energy, or the return is going to be very small. In a habitual set of circumstances, the cognitive load is low. So when Maggie pointed out that what they did is they put up a banner which laid out the things that were there, this was very similar in some ways to the work that Jay Russo did 35 years ago, looking at the value of unit pricing. In other words, behavior changes when you put those little unit price labels on the grocery shelves, because they matter. But when we put the little labels with calorie counts, or we put the little labels with other types of things, they don't necessarily count. And also things like mood and emotion come in. Is this an emotional decision? Is it one that's going to be driven by my preferences for color, my preferences for certain types of smells, and on down the line? And then am I making an individual decision, or am I making a group decision? Am I making a decision for my family? Am I making a decision for myself? Am I making a public decision versus a private decision? All of these things are known to actually materially matter in the nature of the process and the outcomes associated with consumer decisions. So how do consumers value social stance? And here's where I'm going to aggregate a lot of the literature. The one thing that I think people have not talked about is the extent to which purchasing is contextual. And that is that the behavior that individuals engage in reflects the context more than their underlying beliefs. In fact, the studies that we have done has shown that there's zero correlation between what consumers say and what they actually do when you put them in experiments or field situations. Okay, so generalized statements about relating behaviors back to beliefs or moral stance actually simply doesn't work. And when you see situations where justifications come in, and so this is a lot of work that John Eckhart and I did, and there's a video of consumers in 8 different countries where we look at this type of stuff. The justifications arise simply because there's a conflict between the supposed values and the actions the individuals are taking. In other words, there's an enormous amount of cognitive dissonance associated with, yes, and I really want to be green, but I really want that handbag, or I really want those running shoes, or I really want that car. Also, individuals are very heterogeneous. They simply don't follow a set of patterns that reflect good and bad, as Mike Lenox has pointed out. What this implies, it implies that simple models fail. because consumers don't make major decisions based upon whether those decisions in and of themselves reflect moral good or moral bad. They make those decisions based upon a lot of complex things, as I've talked about. It's also the case that individuals lie. They don't understand their values necessarily. They don't understand their beliefs, and they don't necessarily at times understand even their own attitudes, which implies that stated preference types of approaches, which rely on surveys and individuals making general statements about would they do this or would they do that, or how important is being green to them, those things tend to lose their validity and become pretty meaningless. Individuals are to some extent rational, but they make trade-offs, and they make complex trade-offs. So we end up with circumstances where everyone cares, but we don't really necessarily know how much they care, nor do we know how they trade off what they care. So they might say, yes, indeed, I care about the environment, but if you turn around and you say, well, you can invest in the environment, or you can invest in your children's schooling. You can invest in the environment, or you can invest in healthcare. You can invest in the environment, or you can invest in old age care. Those are the sorts of trade-offs that actually have to be dealt with. And actually, those are the trade-offs in some sense that politicians make all the time. But as individuals, we have to think about the opportunity cost associated with behaving in one way versus behaving in another way. And there's also the issue of the behavioral outlets in which these things occur. As Maggie pointed out, making things public really does matter. Donations which are public, for example, work on volunteering and donating, show very clearly it matters whether you're doing something publicly or you're doing something privately. People will do more things publicly than they will do things privately. And organizations, in fact, work to make these types of decisions more public so that they actually can generate more outcomes. People will actually use social functionality, provided that social functionality adds value, as Mike was pointing out. It's in the eye of the beholder. But what they won't do is they won't subject themselves to giving up on other things in the portfolio of the value structure that they get from consuming products. And also, people don't shift very much. They have the equivalent technological resistance, something which I'll come back to in a minute. But people don't change their decision models very easily. It takes shocks. And in some sense, COVID is a good example of a shock which may change people's decision models. So there may be good outcomes from the COVID circumstances related to consumer behavior simply because it puts their decision models under stress. They can't search in the same way that they've done. But at the end of the day, as Mike pointed out, and as Maggie pointed out, and as Carolyn pointed out, there are consumers who will act based on their beliefs. But the reality is that these are very complex. And typically when we see them, we typically see them in small niches. There has yet to be the issue associated with the scaling up of social values in markets. And let me give you an example of this. I'm just going to go through this quickly, because this is an example where there's been policy interventions in a set of circumstances in which governments have been forcing organizations, energy providers, to put smart meters in people's homes. Okay, and there have been a series of studies on this, and the reality is that the smart meters actually don't work. They don't actually lead to the changes in behaviors, nor are they things that the consumers, in spite of everything that's said, actually buy into. And yet the governments continue to push this. So there's a belief on the part of the government that yes, the consumers are resistant to these types of things, but we have to mandate them so that we can actually get to the outcome that we want. But the reality is that the reason that the consumers accommodate the smart meters isn't really the reasons that we would think based upon rational behavior. Okay, so for example, if you look at what a 2% savings amounts to, it amounts to increasing electricity prices by 11%, which no politician would do, or trying to get people to turn off light bulbs or turn off things like window air conditioners. So when you look at the alternatives that are available to policymakers, they have a choice. They can try to get people to change the ways in which they do certain things, or they can rack up the prices by some significant amount. And given that racking up the prices by some significant amount is very politically detrimental to them, they would choose to use the alternative, even if that alternative is very inefficient. And if you look at two sets of studies, one of which is in American Economic Review, basically both of these show that the end result is that there appears to be a surge effect initially when people get the smart meters, but when you look at the long term, you effectively get the equivalent of what is a Hawthorne effect. So Alcott and Rogers basically show that what happens is you get a positive effect and then it goes back to the baseline. Daniel Schwartz in his dissertation work when he was at Carnegie Mellon basically looked at what happens when you tell people that they've had smart meters installed even when they haven't, and the reality is that what they do is they switch back.
Please,
and this is repeated again and again. I'm going to be finished in a minute. Okay. This is going to be repeated again and again, and that is decision models don't change easily. Statements and learning intent are overstated, and there's no real relationship between the underlying stated preferences and the revealed behaviors. I'll skip this. I'll just go through this quickly to get to the what should we be doing. And this is where I'm going to kind of reinforce what Magali has said. And that is, I think that what we have to do is not lose sight of the fact that that consumers are the ultimate arbiter of this. Therefore, we have to embrace heterogeneity. We have to embrace the fact that consumers are very different. We have to study consumer decision models, not just consumer outcomes. We can't just treat them as kind of blobs and outcomes which are independent of the nature of the human beings underlying them. We have to think about the nature of the decision processes they use, including complementary and what's competing components of them and their co-decision makers. And then we actually have to add in the variety of the context. We have to think about the nature, not only about trying to change people's viewpoints on things, but as Magali showed, we've got to think about the nature of the context in which the behaviors occur. And this is very important in terms of the normative decisions, because what policymakers can do is policymakers can't change consumers' decision models. What they can do is they can change context. And so for the policymakers, as Carolyn was pointing out, and for the consumers, as Maggie was pointing out, it really does come down to context. And so with that, what I want to do is I want to turn it now over to a constructive discussion, which I think will be really quite insightful in terms of sort of kind of looking at the different perspectives. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. Wow, that's a lot of stuff from a variety of different angles to take in. But I think we've ultimately come back to kind of a micro macro kind of tension here that we might explore a bit more before we get into the very specific questions of the audience members. But I was pleased to see that we did come back to, what's going on inside the heads of stakeholders or consumers in this case, and how do we get them to, there are ways to kind of nudge them, to encourage them to do certain things that are correct. But I want to expand, but Mike, is pointing out, there's also some systems level change here that actually is key to making all this work. And I want to think in terms of almost the ethical implications of who gets to decide what to encourage and nudge consumers to do, what is right in this system. How do we decide? Because, even, Milton Friedman was skeptical of firms getting to decide what are the social services provided in a community just because they have the resources to do it. So in the same way, we have collectivist societies that might be fine with taking this from the top down. We have the US who ain't nobody telling me no nothing, right? That would go from the bottom up. So how do we figure out, who gets to decide how to manipulate consumer minds if we want to make it very Orwellian in a way? Maggie?
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out, and that kind of builds on what Caroline was saying, that we are talking about the second best solution, right? So we're saying, what can we do if the government doesn't act? What can we do, and how do to get the consumers to move ahead and purchase green products, or sustainable products, however we want to define them, or reduce their consumption. And so this is second best solution. And in that case, we need to work with them and with their, own motivation and think about this very clearly. But as Tim, pointed out, in the energy sector, we found that, some of the most effective ways to get, people to conserve is to change the code, the building codes, for example. You have to build a certain way, and that's super effective. But if you can't do that, then you're going to go to the next available solution, which is let's try to get people to voluntarily changed in behavior. And then you need to work with them with their, kind of understand better their motivation. So I think it's just, kind of the parameters here are a little constrained. We're constrained, but I'm still kind of, I strongly believe that eventually, the government can do much more effectively if they are willing to.
So to be provocative here, I'm skeptical of our ability to change consumer behavior, despite years of marketing research and the like. I know we have the ability to influence them. When it comes to environmental issues, for example, I'm actually writing a new book on the possibilities of decarbonizing our global economy by 2050, which is kind of what we need to do if we're going to really try to address climate change. There are certain sectors that I'm optimistic. And I'm optimistic because I don't think it will require an upswell of consumers buying green. Electric vehicles come first to mind. That, as kind of Magali pointed out, like Tesla and others that are entering the market are giving a value proposition that consumers are willing to pay, regardless if they care about climate change or being green. Electric utilities are really fascinating right now. There's very little evidence of people wanting to pay a premium for green electricity, right? But renewables are starting to take off, partly because they're lower cost, and utilities like whatever is the lowest cost area of production. I don't want to simplify it because there's a lot of complexities of building out our grid as renewables, and that needs a lot of regulatory and other interventions. But from the consumer side, I don't think that's what's going to drive it. But one of them that gives me the greatest pause, and we kind of laugh about it, but it is actually a serious, big contributor for greenhouse gases, is cattle. It's over about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It is one in which there are some working on kind of technology solutions, everything from probiotics for cows to stop the methane production to, of course, substitutes like, the Impossible Whopper and Impossible Burger that you see out there. But at the end of the day, the simplest solution would be get consumers to stop valuing and getting utility out of eating beef and drinking dairy and the like. And I don't know how you bring that about. And to your point, Mike, the politics of that in the United States, the simplest solution would be, let's put a tax on cattle. But I find that hard to believe that would ever pass in the United States from a political standpoint. So again, we're back into a world of how do you structure consumer demand to devalue beef consumption? I'm generally an optimist, but I'm very pessimistic of our ability to do that.
Let me take a slightly different perspective. I mean, I totally agree with Maggie and Mike. I would never disagree with the two of them, of course not. But maybe taking a slightly different view in a sense of, the question is, okay, how can we change consumer behavior? But isn't there also a risk that we are again putting the responsibility of somebody else on somebody else, correct? This time on the consumer to change the consumer's behavior. Before we were talking about, okay, that's the government's responsibility. But what about companies? Regardless, like I think somebody in the chat mentioned, it is also the companies who can design products for the better future, correct? And for more sustainable practices, regardless of what consumers per se are aware of at this moment, but help shape their perception or help shape their desires.
Yeah, can I make just a few points on there? I mean, I agree with Mike, and this is kind of my view also related to Freeman. And I gave a talk once, which was entitled, "Would you want Walmart making decisions for society?" And when Walmart, for example, many years ago decided that they were going to go organic, there actually wasn't enough organic products in the supply chain to be able to supply Walmart if they did that. And so you do have this issue associated with the fact that the companies, like Carolyn said, the companies do have a role here. And the real question, of course, is kind of who's monitoring them when they do this. And in my parlance, the companies set context. They set the environment in which you purchase. They set the alternatives that you see when you walk into the store. And if you look at something like fair trade, I've done a lot of work with fair trade organizations. Consumers won't pay for fair trade. Okay, in the sense that if you go to them and you sort of kind of put them in a set of circumstances in which they actually have physically there something that they could purchase versus something else for which the price is higher, they do. They balk at that. But that's actually the wrong question. The question is, if everything was fair trade, would they opt out? In other words, if when they walk into the store and all the coffee's fair trade, do they say, no, I'm going to walk out and I'm going to walk down to the street for the one that isn't fair trade? And so for the companies want a singular supply chain. They don't want a complex supply chain. They would, they don't care if it's 100% fair trade or 100% not fair trade. They want it to be efficient. So the question then becomes is, do the consumers opt out? Not whether the consumers opt in. And I think a lot of what matters in many cases is if you put consumers in a set of circumstances, what's their behavioral reaction to this? And if they have alternatives, then you may have a problem. In other words, if you're offering a higher priced product, but if all the companies are structuring this in the right way, then the really question becomes is, do the consumers opt out of that market and go to another market? And if they don't opt out, then they kind of have bought into the new context that you've created for them. And you can get the outcome that you want. So I think that a lot of what Mike was talking about with respect to beef and other things, the real question, of course, is what are the companies going to do in terms of structuring the menus in McDonald's or structuring the menus in Burger King, so that what the consumers are going to do is the consumers are going to actually have a different context in which they make the decision and therefore make a different decision. But it's the company that sets the context.
So they've already started with a McPlant now at McDonald's, I believe, the latest thing I saw there. But so I'm going to ask that, the panelists just look at the chat and see if there's some questions that you want to entertain. But in the meantime, I'm going to post one to Mike Lenox here and ask you, I get what you're saying, and I think I agree with it in general, but with the notion that if it doesn't pay, then it's Milton Friedman CSR kind of logic. But I wonder, so then it's only CSR after it fails to pay. Some of the, the logic of that collapses. But what I wanted to ask about is, can CSR be an investment even under the Friedman framework? And so is there a time horizon involved in that calculation?
Yeah, I think it just goes back again how we define CSR and how difficult that is. Actually, I wanted to tackle one of the questions when the first one's posted, which was about CSR and sustainability, and is there a way to bring those two together? I've thought a lot about this on the environment side of how is there an objective measure of environmental impact? And there have been lots of efforts to try to determine the objective measure of environmental impact. Probably most famously, all the efforts with LCA, life cycle analysis, to try to truly assess the environmental impact. And what you realize very quickly is that it is impossible to have a quote unquote objective measure. It is actually a value laden measure, even for something as narrowly defined as environmental impact, because what you start to get are trade-offs within the environment, right? I'm going to make a choice of whether I'm going to have an effluent that pollutes the stream versus an air, pollutant that might harm, human health in a different way. How much do you value birds versus fish, right? Like these go right back to utility judgments of humans. Now there's whole vast literatures on like contingent valuation and environmental economics that tries to put prices on these things. But at the end of the day, it's still the same problem, that it's a value judgment being discerned from these social constructs that we have. I do think there is some progress that can be made when we define it very narrowly. So for example, carbon footprint, like that is something we could probably actually do. We can measure objectively and then make some discerning here about how that then impacts materiality for the company and the like. But the second we try to create these broader constructs, nearly impossible to have it be anything again but a social construct that we're creating.
Thanks. And so if there's any other questions any of you want to take on, or I can pull down questions, but I'm glad to have you guys even question each other, follow up with each other, but I'll let you take the lead and I'll fill in any gaps.
I just wanted to say, Tim, if you were making those slides on the fly there, I'm incredibly impressed that you were able to put all that together in the half hour that we had there. So that was amazing.
So I just wanted to kind of, go back to this idea of that, Tim and Michael, you were talking about innovation and Tim, you're saying, well, you know, kind of the default, but the default is the government. We're going back to that. There's no other way to get everybody on the same page. We see the same, and Caroline has been working a lot on that, on ESGs and disclosure. You know, to kind of have a level playing field, you need the government. So that's kind of, you know, our problem. But to change behavior, what we've seen, I think I would like to go back to our current situation. We have completely changed our behavior in the last few months, right? For, you know, health reasons. The government has been taken, all these governments have been taken, decisions without much numbers, it seems to me, you know, kind of like the economics was not really present too much in there. It was mostly about health as a kind of a main dependent variable suddenly. And I strongly believe that we haven't played that enough with the environment on how our health is dependent from this, and how, you know, kind of the environmental and social elements are working together. And that's, I think, an incredibly, kind of important driver. I might even think, Mike, you're saying, oh, we're on beef, you know, how to get people to change. I mean, the health component of, you know, kind of our, you know, food structure might help people to change the way they eat. Otherwise, you know, it's going to be hard to get them to change. Hopefully there are innovations coming up, you know, meat that is kind of created from, you know, kind of the cells. So is kind of a new solution that might actually be, you know, kind of an alternative that is providing the same level of proteins, but you don't need to grow an animal, you just grow cells. So that's, you know, the culture meat. So we have, you know, kind of two things. We have health as a big, big driver that I think we haven't used enough. And it works even with energy, which is kind of interesting as a driver for people to change their, you know, how much electricity they consume. And second, we do have some of these innovations that might actually change completely the way, you know, we look at some of these products. And that might be way more, you know, when you offer alternatives, way more effective, I think, than, you know, trying to just, you know, kind of hope that people will, you know, think about change like this. So these are kind of just 2 points I wanted to make in response to what we were talking about.
I just saw a question come up about, you know, should companies be responsible in terms of their lobbying activities? So this is a article that many of us on this call actually were part of, with Magali being one of the leads on this, of whether CSR needs CPR for corporate political responsibility. I wanted to tackle that just to advocate that I actually think that is one of the things that we can really hold firms to task on. From a transparency standpoint, and even just from a kind of a public shaming standpoint. Take an example that, again, to be provocative, you know, discussions about whether oil and gas companies should become renewable energy companies, in my mind, is folly. There's nothing in their capability set that aligns with renewable energy. They're not only totally different technologies, they're actually totally different markets. One's for electric utilities, one's for like automobiles and the like. And at the end of the day, the way these things typically pan out is that oil and gas companies need to go out of business. And the same is actually about true with cattle, right? So, you know, what we need is the cattle farmers to go out of business, which I know is a very provocative thing to say. What we don't need as they start to go out of business is for them to lobby to slow technological shifts and change from coming. And we should hold them to task for that if they're out there doing that, which we know they are, in fact. I mean, I just recently came across an example of basically trying to argue with communities. There's groups out there doing this, astroturfing, arguing that solar panels are dangerous to your health to have them in your community, to try to get communities to stop having solar panels put in there. I mean, we've had that with wind for a while, but the fact that even solar panels apparently, and again, it's all backed by the oil and gas industry that are trying to prohibit technological shifts that in many ways the market is actually starting to push now. So anyway, I'm an advocate that like there is something to be said for holding firms to task for engaging in political lobbying and the like that are counter to societal goals.
So just to add on what Mike mentioned in terms of corporate political action, correct? A lot of our research is about corporate social responsibility, not really looking at the corporate political actions or the portfolio of non-market strategies available to companies. Now, for example, companies pushing for the disclosure of non-financial information with respect to, for example, the mining and oil companies. So there were a couple of chat questions / comments about mining companies and how does it affect them. And So what I observe in my role also at the Principle of Responsible Investing community is a lot of investors, for example, deeply care about transitioning to a low carbon economy. They deeply care about understanding what is the exposure to climate change risks of their portfolio companies, but it's very difficult for them to assess it if there's no disclosure of it, correct? And so you can imagine if actually companies lobby for a mandatory disclosure of their portfolio companies with respect to their ESG, including climate change risks, it would allow for them to make more informed decisions, so more informed decisions by customers, but also by investors, and a more efficient capital allocation, which eventually would probably what Mike suggests, that oil companies, the dirty industries, would run out of business eventually, but it would also foster the development of new technologies.
Yeah, I kind of want to come in here as well, because I think there's a kind of a bit of a US-centric view about the nature of sort of corporate political lobbying. We've got to be very careful about, right? And I think that, but I do think that there's another aspect of this. And one of the things that I tried to emphasize is try to understand what the decision maker is doing. Try to understand the process by which they do what they do, and what they're trying to achieve by that. And one of my favorite papers goes, I think it's the 1960 something, by an economist named Magali on the passing of the Clean Air Act in the United States. And he talked about how ultimately the Clean Air Act in the United States was passed as a coalition of northern industrial states and Western kind of eco states. And the senators and congressmen who voted against it were Southerners. And one of the questions was what was going on. And it turned out that when you looked at the law had stricter standards for new plants than it did for the retrofitting of old plants, which meant that if you were working in a steel mill in Gary, Indiana, you could now actually impose a tax on, say, Thiessen or a foreign steel company that was going to build an arc furnace plant in Alabama. And therefore, what they did is they actually got this coalition of sort of the dirty industry and the eco people together enough to be able to change the law. And I think that a lot of this really is, I think that at times we tend to abstract in our academic work as to the nature of the complexity of how these things actually occur and the trade-offs that the politicians themselves make, because ultimately there are second order effects. So another one of my favorite papers is a paper by Sam Peltzman on mandatory seatbelts. And it's ultimately to get people to use seatbelts, and for auto safety, the government mandated this. What happened? The number of deaths in automobile accidents went down. The number of injuries in automobile accidents went up, and the number of pedestrians and cyclists killed and injured went up because of the second order effects. People changed their behavior. They felt safer. They drove faster. They drove a little bit more reckless. But there was a clear trade-off. And that is fewer deaths in automobiles, but a couple more dead pedestrians. But ultimately, it was kind of the change in the context. And as Maggie pointed out, COVID was a shock to the system. You couldn't use your old decision rules. You couldn't shop in the same way you shopped. You couldn't work in the same way you worked. The real question, of course, is whether, like those studies I showed on smart meters, does the behavior spring back? Or does it stay in a kind of permanent state of change? And we don't know the answer to that.
I want you to continue to kind of cherry pick from the list of questions what you'd like to deal with, but let me pose one to everybody in the meantime and ask, what research question would you really love a doctoral student to approach you with to work on as a dissertation advisor? What do you really want to see done in this area?
So, rephrase your question. Oh.
No, rephrase the question. Yeah, sure, of course.
No, Mike, you go ahead.
I was just going to, again, make a gratuitous plug for my book with Ronnie Chatterjee, because when you look at that book, we're making a lot of assertions. And I feel like if you just go through those assertions, a lot of them actually need to be more rigorously tested, right? And I think that's, and especially with this question that I am obviously passionate about innovation and how innovation systems drive forward innovation. The way I like to frame it is, a lot of the economic and strategy work that's on innovation is really about how do we increase the rate of innovation. So assuming more innovation is always good, and if we can get more innovation in our economy, that's a good thing. There's an alternative, which is the direction of innovative activity. How do we direct innovative activity towards these societally desired ends? And that's a really tough question because at least I believe that overhanded government direction of innovative activity will potentially kill innovation, but we don't want to let it just be a free market either. So we're talking about I always say it's like putting guardrails on innovation to get it towards these sustainable solutions that we want, but not so constrained that we kill innovation in the first place. I just think that is a broad question that has any number of different ways you could approach it, and a really tough one that I don't think policymakers in particular have good ideas about at this point.
I think that, from this discussion, I really feel that, a lot of the contextual kind of environment is important. And what I want from my student now is to work with me on experimenting solutions with businesses. How can we work with businesses so that instead of waiting for them to kind of do their things, and then we, can evaluate this, co-develop solutions with them. And I think that's really, kind of more difficult, but more and more students are interested in this. For example, and to kind of build on some of what Caroline is doing is, how do you develop metrics to evaluate, businesses? We have some working with some California, agencies, how to help them design better policies. And then we work with them to develop these policies. And I think that's what students should do now. It's just like much more active, kind of research, because, we've made a lot of progress on kind of what we think the theory, and but I'm not sure we've been going far enough in terms of helping, kind of think about solutions. We've been very good at analyzing the problem, and today is a good example of that. We're really good at that. But so then in terms of solutions, I would encourage, kind of PhD students to work on that hand in hand with either, government agencies or businesses.
So building on this, before I retweak the question, along the lines that Maggie and Mike said, how do companies impact the system, correct? How can companies, organizations, not just for-profit, but also non-profit organizations, help really tackle the grand societal challenges that we are facing? But on the other hand, also, how does the system, for example, climate risk, climate change, how does that impact the companies? I think they, this looking at the system level more, this is exciting and so important avenues for future research. Having said this, let me retweak your question. And I don't think the relevant question is what I think students should do. I think the relevant question is more, students should ask themselves early, what do they want to do, and where do they want to achieve impact in the long term? I'm not relevant.
Yeah, I think I think we have to also distinguish here, and I understand the value of doing work with companies. And I have done much more work with companies than I have done in the published stuff that I've done. And some of it's been far, far more interesting. In the end, I'm not convinced that that's doable in the time frame in which we're kind of working, particularly with respect to climate change, which means that in some sense it's working with policymakers and government decision makers much more so, and really influencing them in a very direct way. And one thing I'd like to point out just very quickly is that if it turns out that the parliamentary library in the United Kingdom has no access to any academic journals. So what we write is absolutely totally meaningless to the policymakers. They get all their information from think tanks and in other sorts of groups, which means that we actually have to have an ability. And the question, of course, is how do you take all the stuff we know and package it in a manner that influences somebody who's going to make big multi-industry, multi-country decisions. That's beyond graduate students. I think, I don't think the graduate students can solve that. I think the graduate students should work on the things that motivate and excite them, and not, like Carolyn, not be affected by me. I think the problem is not the graduate students. I think the problem is the professors. And I think the problem is the professors in the associations. We don't have enough influence with the big decision makers to get them to understand the value of the work that we've done as a community and how that work can be applied, in a way that is equivalent to what's been done with the vaccines. The governments did align to a great extent. They competed, but they aligned. And I think in that sense, I would suggest, Mike, that that's the bigger question. It's not the graduate students. The graduate students are little minors. It's the big question of sort of kind of how can we get all the stuff we know to those people so that they can make the sorts of kind of bold decisions that are necessary, because I don't think that marginal decisions will cut it.
So if we lived, it's 2020, anything can happen, I guess. And so if we were in this weird world where you were King Tim, what would that look like? How do we get that influence? Do we have any prospect for doing it? Is there any format?
Well, I guess put it this way, not everything will happen in 2020. The Jets will not win the Super Bowl. So don't even consider that as an alternative. It's sort of kind of, there's some things which are impossible. But I do think that ultimately how we influence groups like the Academy or other groups to do this, and this has been tried in a number of other venues, to where we get voice. And I always tell graduate students that you have to be smart, you have to be lucky, but you also have to know who you want to influence and have a strategy for influencing those people. And the real question, of course, in our work is, who do we want to influence? If we want to influence the companies, there are millions of companies. So it will take a long time to influence companies. So if you don't have time, I think that there has to be a concerted campaign to think about how collectively groups like this can put together a manifesto which gets into the Financial Times, which gets into the Economist, which gets into the New York Times, which catches the attention of decision makers in a way that they would call upon us to help them find solutions.
Just to add to that, I mean, I've been a big advocate for years that those of us kind of in the business scholarly community have a unique perspective and voice that does not get heard enough in policy debates. So I'm going to pick on a controversial one, another provocative one that Tom Lyon and I have had some blog debates on in the past, which is putting a price on carbon. To be very clear, I'm all for putting a price on carbon. But if you listen to policymakers and the environmental economists, I mean, it's like the only solution, right? Like you put a price on carbon, you're done. And then we debate whether we want to do a tax or a cap and trade system. What I'm advocating for is a more robust industrial policy and technology policy by government. And that's one element of it, but there's thousands of other levers that could possibly be pulled. And some of those levers might actually be more effective, especially in our current political environment, like here in the States, than always just going for the one solution of putting a price on carbon. And I think it's where our community has a, perhaps, dare I say, a little more sophisticated thinking about the ways in which businesses, not just markets, but businesses respond to different incentives and the like, that we could broaden the portfolio of policy levers that could be pulled. and we should try to take advantage of that. Now, Tim, I'd be curious how we do that. Like, how do we get greater voice out there? But I think we definitely should if we can.
Just so I think, Mike, we are expanding the question to how can we have more of an impact as researchers. And so, kind of there are organization and Mike, kind of founded the Alliance for Research on Corporate Sustainability. And I would encourage you to participate in this organization. Tom Lyon, who is present here, is the current president. And so there are, kind of initiatives like this. And as part of ARCS, we actually did issue Tim a manifesto on, and that's kind of this paper, CSR and CPR, which had a big impact. And I think we need to do more of these. It's been, pretty successful, maybe not as, kind of what, in the Financial Times, and that would be the next one we're going to do probably, hopefully. But I think this is really important. The other thing that's important, and then I am a big advocate for getting, our PhD students actually to kind of think about this early on, not just, like, okay, think about, it's part of the way we should do research now, to be kind of thinking about having an impact. The metrics are starting to be there, actually. If you think of how we are evaluated, just look at, Altmetrics and others to kind of get us to be out there and be more vocal. We have pieces, places like The Conversation that now are providing some more public, kind of forum. You have actually some I think there is more kind of a move towards this. The other piece that I think we don't think about enough is our teaching. I am amazed now when I see where my students have gone and who they are. They're, I've got so many like chief sustainability officer here and there. It's fantastic. And we have also this ability in bringing our research to our teaching, in writing case studies. I know it's not as rewarded, but it is important. I think it can have also an important impact.
Thank you. So any parting shots from the panelists? Any final words? Is that enough already?
Perhaps one thought, and I think it was also highlighted in our conversation. There's opportunity for us ourselves to engage in more practice relevant conversations to convey our research, especially high quality research, to practitioners, correct? As Timothy highlighted, practitioners have access to the free resources on the web, but not our intellectual property rights protected journals, which causes troubles as well. So, convey our insights to the practitioners, engage with them, but also engage in more multidisciplinary research across silos to make progress in this field. And thank you so much, Mike, for organizing this phenomenal seminar series.
Yeah, I mean, my one final word is also to thank Mike and everybody. Is really, we did veer off subject, but one thing I would say is that not everybody is a firm, but everybody's a consumer. And therefore, if I go back to the one point I was making, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about things like CSR and what employees are doing, but there's ultimately an individual equation here. It is individual social responsibility. You can't have CSR without having individual social responsibility, and ultimately, I think that is the key to almost all of this. And we sometimes lose sight of this. We sometimes think that the firm should be doing things that we as individuals ourselves wouldn't take responsibility for. And I think it's important that we know that and we acknowledge that, and we teach our students that, and we talk to businesses about that.
I would just end again thanking Mike and everyone for organizing this. It's been fabulous. I would just be an advocate again that at the end of the day, what we do as academics is to have an impact on the world. It is not just to have wonderful, Zoom meetings like this and talk amongst ourselves. It is actually to have impact. We have that through our teaching, of course, but we hopefully have that through our scholarship as well. And I just encourage everyone, all the doctoral students and others, to always have that in mind as you think about your work. Are you asking important questions? Are you asking the right questions? And then how do you then perhaps translate that to a broader audience so you can have impact?
All right, well, it's, Friday the 13th, 2020. We went a full 90 minutes and we did not get Zoom bombed. Nothing bad happened. The technology stayed. So A sincere thanks to the panelists for a great debate. So let's have a nice virtual clap for all of you. Many thanks to all of you for participating as well. And as a reminder, the materials, including the reading list, slides, video, and chat transcript will be posted soon. We'll send notice to all the registered attendees, and you can find links on the RICSI website, which is at business.rutgers.edu/RICSI, RICSI. Please note that I've set up a Twitter account to use for refinements of any research questions as well, still in its formative stage. But the Twitter handle is @research_better, and the title is Better Management Research Questions. Another thing to look for is this summer 2022 special issue of Rutgers Business Review. It's going to be focused on this seminar series. Most of the presenters throughout the course of the year have agreed to write pieces for it that summarize and extend these debates. In addition, be on the lookout for a call for papers for a special issue of Journal of Business Ethics that was just approved this morning. The title is Save Our Cities, Exploring the Intersection of Ethics, Diversity and Inclusion, and Social Innovation in Revitalizing Urban Environments. Ted Baker, Brett Gilbert, Corrine Post, Jeff Robinson, and I are the guest editors for that. And initial drafts are due on January 17th, 2022, long lead time. Finally, please do join us for our next session in which we debate the question, is the firm a meaningful unit of analysis for social innovation? We got to some of that here, I think. That session will feature Joanna Mayer and Mark Ventresca arguing in the affirmative, Irene Henriquez and Tyler Rye arguing against, and Christine Beckman is the moderator. And we'll experiment a bit more with the format in that session too. So it's on Friday, December 11th, same bat time, same bat place. Hope to see you there. Thanks again.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You want us to hang around, Mike?
You're welcome to. I don't know how to find out who's still, I don't know. I don't see the hand raising function. So I'm glad to have you guys stick around. And if anybody wants to ask a question in the audience, let's see if do I have a means of unmuting you, or you could just post something and I could individually unmute you.
No, it's okay.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again. And
Thank you.
hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Yeah. And as I said, there's no way the Jets are going to win the Super Bowl. So not everything can happen in 2020.
Nothing.
Yeah, that in the Pittsburgh Pirates will still be the worst team in the Major League Baseball.
They're all going to get COVID and it's going to collapse. All right.
Okay. See you later. Okay, I'll head out. Okay, bye.